The first snow came early that year. It fell in silence, like a soft apology over a town too proud to ask forgiveness. Cold winds scraped through the bones of the Blue Ridge, pushing white drifts into the cracks between the cabins, the church, and the blacksmith shop. And standing alone at the edge of it all, a pale woman in black stared into the white blur, her hands red from the cold and a baby quiet on her hip. Her name was Margaret Lane, 28, widow, seamstress, and not from here. She arrived 7 months ago, pregnant, wearing a mourning dress and dragging a broken cart. Folks said she'd come from the Missouri side. Her husband had died in a logging accident, or maybe a bar fight, depending on who you asked. What mattered was she was white, young, alone, and now had a child who bore the copper-gold skin of a man who couldn't possibly have been her late husband. No one said anything outright, but they watched, always watched. The Cherokee town she stumbled into wasn't unkind, just cautious. The locals lived tight lives here, stacked between memory and survival. And while some offered her work, or scraps, or an old crib, they made sure to remind her, with quiet looks and longer silences, that she was only passing through. Margaret didn't fight it. She knew how to be invisible. Grief had taught her that. So had hunger. Each morning she washed clothes down by the creek. She bartered hand-stitched bonnets for goat milk and chopped wood for stew bones. When the baby came, a girl with dark curls and eyes too knowing for her days, Margaret named her Lena and swaddled her in fabric scraps stitched with trembling hands. The town midwife helped deliver Lena, said nothing about the baby's features, just looked Margaret in the eyes and said, "Name her Strong, she'll need it." 7 months passed. The child grew, and the stairs grew colder. Then came the day the snow arrived, and the men from town gathered by the smokehouse to whisper about who belonged and what might bring danger. Margaret heard them. She always heard them. So she packed a basket with bread and thread and slung Lena on her hip. She walked out toward the wood line, toward where she'd seen the deer trails and shadowed movement, toward a man they called only Hawkeyes. They said he lived out there, half hunter, half myth. Some said he was touched by spirits, others swore he was once a war scout. No one truly knew. He came into town only to trade, hides for salt, berries for iron. Tall, broad-shouldered, silent, eyes like amber steel. Margaret had seen him once. He'd helped her lift a water barrel without speaking, just looked at her, nodded once, then vanished into the trees. But something in that look, not pity, not desire, recognition, as if he knew the shape of loneliness too. She didn't expect him to help. She just wanted to walk, to not feel eyes on her back, to find a clearing where Lena could breathe without whispers in the wind. But the snow deepened, and Margaret, wearing her thin boots and holding her child, began to falter near the ridge. Her knees buckled, the baby whimpered, and from the silence of the trees came the sound of a branch breaking, a soft crunch, then a voice, low and measured. "You shouldn't be out here." She turned, and there he was, Hawkeyes, wrapped in furs, bow slung over his back, snow in his hair. No expression on his face, but his eyes, they held stories. Margaret opened her mouth, but no sound came. Then she sank to her knees, not from fear, but because she finally knew someone had seen her fall. The first frost of winter clung to the windows of Margaret's cabin like the breath of the dead. She sat still at the edge of her cot, her hands stiff from scrubbing laundry in water so cold it left her skin raw. The Cherokee women did not speak to her. The children no longer wandered close. Even the old dog who used to wait at her door for scraps had stopped coming. She had become the ghost of her own story. Every morning,
She left a small offering by the edge of the forest, a braid of bread, a few drops of tea, or sometimes just the warmth of a prayer. She did not know who she was asking for mercy. Maybe it was the land. Maybe it was the soul of her husband, still caught somewhere between this world and the next. And yet, there was one who watched her. He never spoke, never entered the village gates, but every now and then, just before sunset, she would catch him standing at the far end of the clearing, his dark eyes unreadable, his hair tied back with sinew, his rifle resting lightly in his hands. A silent sentinel, like something the mountain had carved for its own. At first, she was afraid of him. She had grown up hearing stories about warriors in war paint and scalps on belts, the way her father's generation told it, blood and savagery. But this man was nothing like that. His stillness was not born of threat. It was sorrow. Watching him was like seeing your own grief reflected in another face. And then one day, he left something for her. On the stump just beyond her doorstep, a rabbit, cleaned and wrapped in cloth. She stood there a long time staring at it, the chill wind combing through her hair. There was no mout, no tracks, just the quiet gesture of a man who owed her nothing, but gave her something anyway. That evening, she roasted the rabbit slowly, seasoning it with what little salt she had left. She lit a candle, not to celebrate, not to mourn, but simply to make the night feel less hollow. She whispered, "Thank you," into the darkness, though she knew he wouldn't hear it. The next day, she found a pile of firewood neatly stacked where her old woodpile had been scattered by the wind. 2 days after that, a snare appeared near her shed, with a squirrel already caught in it. By the end of the week, the silence between them had become something sacred. He never crossed her doorway, never asked for food, nor offered his name. But she started leaving him little things, a jar of gooseberry jam, a pair of mended socks, a note written on parchment and tucked under a flat rock near the trail where she thought he might walk. "Thank you for seeing me." The words felt too small, but it was all she had. The townsfolk noticed, of course. They always noticed. The glances became stares, the whispers hardened into words loud enough to hear. "She's bewitched," someone spat at the well, "trading with heathens, white trash marrying into shadows." But Margaret said nothing. What could she say? That in the slow steps of this silent man, she felt safer than she ever had in the company of men who smiled with knives behind their backs? That her grief found its echo in the space between his footsteps? One night they came, 3 of them, young men from the edge of town, drunk on winter cider and their own righteousness. They kicked in her door and threw her food to the ground, called her a witch, told her to leave by sunrise or be burned with the next full moon. She said nothing. She just stood there with her hands shaking, a broom handle in her grip, like that thin stick could ward off their hate. They spat in her hair and laughed, and then they left. But before the door could finish swinging shut, there was a sound from the trees. A single note, low, final, then silence. When she opened her eyes, the moon was high, the men were gone. But on her step, where the soot from their boots still stained the floor, lay a single eagle feather, tied at the base with sinew and beads the color of stormlight. A warning, a vow. She picked it up with trembling hands, and for the first time in months, she cried without shame. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew this. She was no longer alone, and in this town that wanted to bury her, someone had begun to dig her soul out with bare hands.
His name came to her not through lips, but through wind. One evening, as she was out gathering water from the creek, an old Cherokee woman approached, eyes clouded with age but sharp enough to see into marrow. She didn't speak at first, just stared at Margaret's hands, red from cold, trembling as she lifted the pail. "You don't belong here," the old woman said, in a voice like dry leaves, "and yet the mountain hasn't spat you out." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't know how to. The woman tilted her head toward the woods. "You see him, don't you?" A beat of silence. Margaret nodded once. "They call him Tatsua, Hawkeyes. Lost his wife to fever 2 winters ago. Never spoke a word again. He walks with death, but he does not belong to it." Hawkeyes. The name struck something in her, a note that had been waiting to ring for years. He watches you because you remind him that the fire is still warm somewhere. The old woman turned, leaving behind more mystery than answers. From then on, Margaret whispered that name like a prayer when she left things for him. Hawkeyes. She would say it under her breath when she saw his figure vanish among the pines, or when she lit the lamp at dusk, hoping he'd see its glow from the ridge. And somehow, slowly, things began to shift. The first time he spoke, it was only one word. She had fallen on the icy path near her shed. Her ankle twisted beneath her, pain blooming up her leg. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, knowing no one would come even if she did. But he came, like he had always been standing behind her. He knelt, his eyes scanning her wound, his breath visible in the cold air. And when she reached out, just slightly, just enough to touch the edge of his coat, he looked at her for the first time without hiding. "Strong," he said quietly, the word falling like a stone into a still pond. She wanted to laugh, wanted to cry. Instead, she nodded. He helped her inside, his arm beneath hers, firm and careful. When she sat down, he wrapped her ankle with cloth taken from her own table. He didn't speak again, not that day, but he stayed until the fire burned low. And when he left, she swore the air he left behind carried something warm. The storm came hard that week. Winds snapped trees in half. Snow blew sideways like a curse. The village huddled in silence, the old trading paths buried in white. Margaret had not seen Hawkeyes in 3 days. On the 4th night, just before dawn, she heard a knock, not at the front door, but the back. When she opened it, he was there. Blood streaked down his shoulder, his coat torn from a fight she could only imagine. He didn't ask for shelter, but his legs buckled just as he tried to step back. She caught him. With all the strength left in her, she pulled him inside, laid him on the cot, and stitched the gash herself. His eyes didn't flinch. He just watched her, jaw clenched, letting her hands do what they had never done before, heal something other than herself. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, brushing his damp hair from his brow. He didn't answer, but when she reached to pull the blanket up, his fingers caught hers, held them. And this time it wasn't silence between them. It was understanding, like the ache of 2 lonely people who had waited too long to belong to something again. But the town was watching. They had seen the man walk through the storm to her door, and in their minds the lines between protection and possession blurred. 2 days after he left, his wound only half healed, she woke to smoke, not from her chimney,
from the edge of her field. Someone had set fire to her fence, the words "White Whore" carved in the snow near her doorstep. Her breath caught. The air turned sharp, not with cold, but with hate. She stood there, frozen, until she saw a mark in the snow, a footprint, large, deep, leading away. But beside it, smaller prints, hoof prints, horse. Someone had ridden close in the night, someone who had watched her sleep. Her fingers trembled as she bolted the door. Her heart pounded not just with fear, but with fury. She had lost a husband to fate. She would not lose her life to men who thought they could control it. That night she didn't light her lamp. She waited in the dark with a rifle across her knees and fire in her throat. But before the moon climbed to its peak, he came again. Hawkeyes. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door like it belonged to him. And for a moment, Margaret thought maybe it did. He saw the carving in the snow, the remnants of ash, and though he didn't speak, his eyes said everything. He wasn't going to let this end with her bones buried beneath the frost. He stood there, tall and resolute, and then he offered her something wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly. A necklace, bone and bead, Cherokee design, but in the center, a carved stone, smoothed into the shape of a hawk's eye. He placed it gently around her neck, then stood back. His face didn't change, but something in her did. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was under the wing of something ancient and dangerous and fiercely alive. And for the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she was home.
There were kinds of silence that soothe, the hush of snow on pine, the quiet of two people who understand each other without words. But there are also silences that rot, suspicious stares left unspoken, grudges passed in glances, hatred that festers in men too cowardly to say your name to your face. Margaret could feel that silence thickening around the town like smoke in a low room. It came in the form of things left undone, a delivery that never arrived, firewood missing from her stack, a child who used to wave at her now hiding behind his mother's skirt. When she walked to the market, heads turned, not toward her, but away. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, as if loving a dead man had earned her sympathy, but being seen with a Cherokee had condemned her to exile. She no longer went out alone after dusk, and she no longer left her door unlocked, not even during the day. Still, she didn't run. She told herself it was stubbornness, but deep down she knew the truth. It was because he hadn't asked her to. Hawkeyes returned each evening, always after dark, sometimes with meat, sometimes just to sit by the fire. They didn't speak often, but when they did, the words came slowly, like the thaw of spring ice. One night, as she was mending the hem of her coat, he broke the silence. "They will come." His voice was steady, low, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. She looked up, needle pausing in her hand. "Who?" He didn't answer right away, just stared into the fire. "The ones who think you don't belong." Margaret exhaled slowly, her fingers curled around the fabric in her lap. "Then let them come," she said, though her voice trembled. "I've survived worse." He turned his head then, slowly, fully, until their eyes met. "No," he said, "not like this." There was something final in his tone, something that didn't ask for her permission. That night he left her with a dagger, bone-handled, etched with markings she didn't recognize. "Keep it on you," he said, and when she reached to take it, his hand lingered over hers, warm, calloused, careful. 3 days later, it happened. The sun had barely risen when she heard the first hoofbeats. Not one rider, 5. Their silhouettes dark against the snow, rifles slung across their shoulders, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Men from the town. One of them dismounted before even knocking, just pushed her door open like it was his own. She stood in the kitchen, a knife in one hand, her heart thudding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. He looked around, smirking. "Thought you'd get away with it, did ya?" She said nothing. Another man stepped in behind him, then another, each of them smelling like cheap liquor and old grudges. "You think because he sneaks around your place at night we wouldn't notice?" They were circling her now, like dogs around a wounded doe. "We let you live here out of pity, but you spit on that." "Get out," she said, her voice shaking. One of them laughed. "Or what? You're going to call him?" And then from the doorway, a voice cut through the room like a blade. "She doesn't have to." It was Hawkeye's. No coat, no hat, just a bow slung over one shoulder and a hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He stepped inside like the storm he'd always been. The men turned, surprised. One reached for his rifle. But before he could even lift it, Hawkeye's moved. A blur of motion. His shoulder hit the man in the chest, sending him sprawling into the table. The others backed up, suddenly remembering that fear had weight. "This is Cherokee land," Hawkeye said, his voice low and burning. "You came here with fire in your hearts. I will send you back with fire on your skin." "Threatening a white man?" the leader spat, backing toward the door. Hawkeye stepped closer. "Protecting my home." The word made Margaret flinch. My home. None of the men fired, because they didn't come for a fight. They came expecting a woman alone. They hadn't planned for a warrior standing between her and the world. And in the end they left, cursing, bruised, but alive, because Hawkeyes had spared them. Margaret knew he could have done worse.
After they were gone, silence returned. But this one was the kind that soothed. He stood in her doorway, his breath heavy, chest rising and falling. Margaret reached for his arm. "You could have killed them." "I would have," he said without hesitation, "if they touched you." Something in her broke at that. Not out of fear, but out of a kind of grief. The kind that comes when someone finally protects you the way you never knew you needed. He looked at her, then at the floor. "I should go," he said. "Why?" "Because next time they won't come with fists. They'll come with fire." She stepped in front of him. "Then stay." He didn't move. "Please," she whispered. "I've already lost one man to death. I don't want to lose another to fear." A long pause. And then, finally, he stepped inside, closed the door, and this time, he stayed. That night she lay beside him for the first time, not as a widow or a stranger or an exile, but as a woman who had chosen. They didn't speak much, just lay beneath the same quilt, her head near his shoulder, their hands intertwined between them. The house no longer felt like a cage or a cabin. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had words for, but somehow both of them understood. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, there was warmth and peace. For now. By the time spring touched the mountain with its first soft blossoms, Emma no longer counted the days.
She had learned how to tend the herbs with the elder women, how to braid sweetgrass with the girls, and how to speak softly in the rhythm of Cherokee thought. But more than anything, she had learned the shape of peace, not the kind that falls from silence, but the kind earned through the ache of trust and the labor of love. One morning the hunter, Towody, led her to the creek where the wild mint grew. The water ran clear, and trout flashed like living stones beneath the surface. He knelt beside a flat rock and unwrapped a pouch of river clay, carefully pressing it into a shape in his hand. When he turned it toward her, Emma's breath caught. It was a small sculpture, rough but unmistakable. A woman cradling a baby. The folds of the blanket were drawn like wind. He said only, "You are not forgotten." Her hands trembled when she took it. In all her life, married or widowed, north or south, no man had ever seen her with such quiet reverence. She whispered, "Why me?" Towody looked up at the sky where a hawk soared, then back at her. Because the hawk sees what others cannot, and you see with your heart. They returned to the village that day with no words between them, but everything had changed. The next morning she awoke to a circle of children at her door, some white, some Cherokee, all bearing small tokens, a string of red beads, a feather, a carved acorn. The women had begun calling her Noya, the Cherokee word for mother of many. She wept, not for grief, but because her soul had finally found a home. Years later, when travelers passed through the mountains and asked about the pale woman who lived with the Cherokee, they were told only this: she came here running, but she stayed to heal others. And somewhere deep in those woods, a stone carving still rested beside a mossy creek, etched by the hands of a man who saw her not as a widow, not as an outsider, but as someone worthy of being loved forever.